It is a real pleasure for us at the Bildner Center and the Graduate Center of the City University to have Ambassador Roberta Lajous or Lajous, depending on whether you want to pronounce the family name in French, which it's several generations in Mexico with a French name, or in Spanish pronunciation, and she will respond to both. She is going to speak on Mexico-U.S. relations, and she is the author of this book that just came out in November and is already in its third printing, so that it has been widely accepted, adopted for course assignment in courses. And when I saw it, I have not read it yet. I'm delighted to have this copy. But I said, that's the kind of book that I read in graduate school eons ago, and it's great to have a new one out like this. Ambassador Lajous has served in the diplomatic service of Mexico for over 30 years, has been posted as ambassador in Bolivia, in Cuba, in Austria, has served in the delegations to the United Nations here, dealing with Security Council affairs, and to the UN agencies, the Atomic Energy Agency in particular, in Vienna. So she has a rich experience and will probably be posted as ambassador to a European capital in the near future. She is a public intellectual, as you can see from this kind of book. So she has written many pieces that we would call op-eds in newspapers in Mexico and serving as a columnist. So she is working not only to explain Mexican foreign policy and the challenges to it, but to make suggestions to the government of Mexico as well, and to seek productive relations with the United States. So I will now let Ambassador Lajous tell us the story of Mexican foreign relations, which this is called the Historia Minima, that is the brief history. It's almost 400 pages long, and she's only got 35 minutes to do it here, so you're going to get a very abbreviated version of it. There will be questions and answers afterwards, so take notes and feel free to ask questions then. Ambassador Lajous, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Erickson. It's really a pleasure to come here to New York and be able to communicate to a wider public about the book I made and the effort behind it. And I want to thank especially Professor Mauricio Font for having this initiative to hold this session here at the Bildner Center, and Araceli Tinajero, who should be here in a while, for having made all the arrangements possible. And I'm so glad to be here. I thought I wasn't going to make it, and I can't thank you enough to be here. I mean, I know it means a special effort on the part of everybody here. So I will be speaking this afternoon about 3 points. One is why I wrote this book and what void I think it really has successfully come to fill. The second is about what's the thesis behind the book. It's already announced that I will be speaking about the peaks and troughs of the Mexico-U.S. relationship. And I will conclude by trying to tell you what is my vision of where we are today and what comes in the immediate future. So first things first. I wrote this book because before entering the Mexican Foreign Service 34 years ago, when I finished graduate school, I didn't finish my PhD, I just finished my master's degree, and I went back to Mexico City and I started teaching at the National University of Mexico on foreign affairs. And I realized how badly there was a need for a text to summarize what were the external relations of Mexico throughout history. There was no single textbook that gave you that information, and I'm afraid there was not one until today. when I was teaching, I had to refer to different documents, I had to hand out photocopies. So I really wanted to tell the story about why it has been so important for Mexico, the relations with the external world. Mexico has always been characterized as a very nationalistic country. And the reason it's very nationalistic is in its history. Mexico has been subject of aggression of major powers, has had a very difficult history throughout the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. And when finally the Mexican Revolution consolidated, Mexico came out as a very strongly nationalistic country that projected this image throughout the world. I thought it was important to explain, and I call external relations because I really don't think there was a foreign policy of Mexico until Benito Juarez being our major national figure, and a major national figure not only on his own, but because he stopped the foreign intervention of the French in Mexico. And he pronounced the first statements and the first principles on which Mexican foreign policy is based. It's the principle of law, el respeto al derecho ajeno es la paz, respect. He says, in individuals as in nations, respect for the rights of others is peace, and that is the cornerstone of our foreign policy. And I don't believe that there was a foreign policy until he inspired this principle and he carried out a project of his own, of a republic, of a federal republic, independent, and that regards Mexicans and foreigners as equal for the law. So it has proven that this book was needed by the fact that, as the Professor Erickson said, it was published in November. The first edition was immediately finished, and then came the second printing, and the first reprint and the second reprint, which just came out. So I have been visiting the major universities in Mexico City that have programs in international relations and also international law. Professors of international law in Mexico regarded as a very, it gives a lot of examples about what they're talking about. And I began to go around outside of Mexico City. I already been to Guadalajara and to Toluca. When I go back, I go to Puebla, which is a major university town. And this is the first presentation abroad, which gives me a lot of pleasure to be here. And I really hope that this textbook, meant for the general public, it's not an academic book, it doesn't have the traditional footnotes, and it doesn't have a cross-reference index. It's a book that is inviting you to read further. Instead of having footnotes, you can read it through. At the end of each chapter, there are recommended books to go deeper into each of the periods dealt in the chapter. There are 10 chapters that cover from 1821, the moment of independence, to the year 2000. I didn't finish until 2012 or 13. I think you have to leave some period of time for events to assess themselves. And also I participated in part of those major events for Mexican foreign policy from the year 2000. I was here at the Security Council in New York, representing Mexico before the United Nations. I was ambassador to Cuba after the major crisis between the Fox government and Fidel Castro. So it's not for me at this moment to write about events that are so recent and that I was personally involved. I will wait till my retirement to write about the really 200 years of Mexican foreign policy and tell it all, even that those parts I was involved. So there are no conclusions in the book yet. Those are yet to come when I finish my diplomatic career. So this is what motivated me, teaching and being able to give students a view and also to invite the general public to know more about Mexico, about Mexican history, about why Mexico is the way it is, and how the relationship with the exterior has made an imprint in Mexico. The main thesis of the book, and I brought here a magazine in English published by the National University that I'm going to leave some copies here, that has the introduction in English for those who don't read Spanish, and it flies for itself, the introduction. It's an essay with this thesis. The thesis is the following: the relationship between Mexico and the United States, which is what specifically I am here to talk about, goes in cycles from getting near to getting far away. That's what I call peaks and troughs. There are moments in our history where we have been very close, and there are moments we have gone each our own way. This answers to a need of Mexico on the one part, coming closer to the United States in order to get the resources needed for its development, for achieving a modernization, industrialization, and the need to withdraw into itself and find its own identity, an identity that is very different from that of the United States. There are few countries in the world that are so different and yet share so much, not only in terms of a border, but also in terms of population exchange, in terms of trade, in terms of investment. So to exemplify my thesis, I am going to go very briefly, don't worry, around 7 points, peaks and troughs, to give you examples of what I'm talking about. In 1821, we became an independent country after a very long war of independence that we fought against Spain. At that moment, there was great optimism about the future of Mexico. Mexico became independent not as a republic, but as an empire, with the first, the throne was offered to a relative, to a descendant of the King of Spain. Spain did not come to grips to accept the independence of Mexico. They didn't send anyone, so the major military commander of the independence movement, Agustin de Iturbide, crowned himself as emperor. And this was a very big country, a country that went from Oregon to what today is Panama, a country rich in natural resources, a country with coast to the Atlantic and to the Pacific, a country that had been known to the world as New Spain, the powerful New Spain with the largest city in the continent, that had been known to the world through the writings of the German scientist Alexander von Humboldt as one of the richest countries because of its mineral resources mainly, but also resources coming from the different climates, from temperate climate to tropical climate, agricultural products. Mexico was a land of the future, was meant to be an important country in the concert of nations. At that time, you must remember, the United States was much smaller size than it is today. It was mainly the 13 colonies growing westward. It was a country in the Atlantic, a country that was an experiment. It was a republic, the first republic of modern times. Yet, what is important is that Mexico, the leaders of Mexican independence, looked up at the United States. Looked up at the United States for two reasons. One, many admired the political system, the concept of a federal republic. And although at the beginning the idea of an empire came triumphant, and that's how Mexico established itself for the first couple of years, the majority thought that the political system of the United States, based on a democracy and an organization decentralized in a federal system, was better. And second, because although Mexico had extreme richness, it also had extreme poorness. And von Humboldt had also described this inequality as being the essence of Mexico. And many Mexicans admired the prosperity of the United States middle class, the prosperity of the farmers, the prosperity of an agricultural nation, and there were many things that were to be looked up. So, at the beginning, the first country that Mexico sought its friendship was the United States. The first ambassadors that were sent were to the United States because Mexico wanted to have a friendship with the United States, to learn more about its political system, about its institution, and about the prosperity of this newly founded agricultural farmers' nation. Yet, this friendship or this admiration was to last for very short. Soon, the ambition of expansion, of manifest destiny towards first Texas and then the rest of what used to be Mexican territory, New Mexico and Arizona and California, parts of Oregon, Utah, became prey of the expansionist fever. And by the year 1847, the US Army had gone all the way into Mexico City. And this is probably the deepest throw I can talk about, not only in the last century, but in our history. This disappointed many, many Mexicans about the United States, and more so those who wanted to imitate the federal republican system of the United States and who saw themselves in Mexican history as liberals. And I want to make it very clear, liberal in the European sense, in the sense of separation of church and state, not in what today is considered a liberal in the United States. I'm talking about 19th century European thought. Liberals, those who wanted more freedom, more liberty, liberales, versus the conservatives, those who wanted the prevailing system coming back from colonial times, where the church and the military had privileges, and they wanted to preserve, those are the conservatives, they wanted to preserve the structure. So it was a very painful moment for the liberals, for those for freedom for the land, freedom from the church, freedom for everybody, freedom of slavery. Mexico declared freedom of slavery the moment it became independent. To have a war with the United States, what a deception. And that shock of having the US Army coming to Mexico City, nobody wanted to negotiate with the US Army because they didn't want to concede. So the government ran away from Mexico City. The US, there's a fantastic, the memoirs of Ulysses Grant, if somebody has ever read it, he went to Mexico as part of the US Army of Intervention, and he has a fantastic diary. And he says that the commanders of the US Army didn't want to go into Mexico City because they thought it was better to negotiate with the established government. But the established government didn't want to negotiate. Nobody wanted to concede. Nobody wanted to be seen as a traitor who was going to give away the territory. So the government went away to Veracruz. And the US Army had to take in Mexico City. And what I consider to be, and I write about that, the patriots who came out to negotiate and to write a treaty, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, to fix a border and prevent the US from taking the whole of the country, which there was a tendency among those expansionists. So one would have thought this would be the end of a good relationship between Mexico and the United States, but very soon after, less than 20 years after, in 1862, we celebrate in Mexico, and you celebrate here in the United States, the Cinco de Mayo. And the Cinco de Mayo, which today still is celebrated widely in Mexico and the United States, accounts for the Battle of Puebla, where the Mexican army, under the guidance of General Ignacio Zaragoza, stopped for once the French army of invasion. The French wanted to establish an empire in Mexico. They had Napoleon III had a vision that the United States was in a civil war and that the South would win. So two countries would remain. There would be not one powerful country in North America, but two, and that a Mexican empire under French, the French protectorate with a European prince, Maximiliano de Habsburgo, would sympathize with the South, with the slavery economy of the South, because in Mexico there was a structure of land tenure where the people were more or less tied to the land, sistema de peonaje, and that way France would have a greater influence first in Mexico than was going to build the canal. He had the idea of building the canal in Nicaragua, which what today is the Panama Canal, and have a wider influence in South America. This vision, of course, was totally thwarted, and history proved to be wrong. The North won, but the French had to go out of Mexico, and in 1867, Maximilian was shot to death. It was after going through trial. And the French had to leave quickly because also conflict was gathering in Europe. But an alliance was formed between President Benito Juárez, who I talked about earlier, a true liberal in the Mexican sense. He wanted the separation of church and state, a true Democrat, and somebody who had a vision for the future of Mexico. And he became an ally. He made an alliance with Abraham Lincoln. Up to today, many Mexicans and Americans enjoy the Juárez-Lincoln scholarships to come and study in the United States, and Americans to go and study in Mexico, because this alliance is the symbol of how close and how important this partnership between Mexico and the United States could be. At that time, the Secretary of State of Benito Juárez, Melchor Ocampo, signed the treaty with the United States, which became, in a way, unfamous, at least for the conservatives, because, first of all, it was a free trade treaty, and second, it gave the right of passage to the U.S. Army in Tehuantepec in case of a military emergency. And it never came into being. It was never approved by the U.S. Senate because of free trade, mind you. But nevertheless, it still stands for the symbol of a close alliance with the United States in times of need and in confronting external enemies from Europe on the one hand, and for conservatives, they still claim that Juárez was too pro-American. Well, after the liberals stayed in power in Mexico, came the Mexican Revolution, which was it was the first social revolution in the world. It started in 1910, 1911, and it was a wave, a movement in many ways against the privilege that the former dictator of Mexico, Porfirio Díaz, who had been a dictator for 30 years, had given, in the eyes of many Mexicans, too much to foreigners. He had tried to accelerate too fast the development of Mexico, had called in foreign capital for the development of the railroad, for the development of mining, and for all infrastructure. And came again in 1911 what I call another trough in the US-Mexico relationship. And this is a very difficult and sad moment when the US ambassador in Mexico City, Henry Lane Wilson, nothing to do with Woodrow Wilson, just the same name, conspired with the conservatives in Mexico City, not only to overthrow President Madero, who was the symbol of the triumphant Mexican Revolution and the democratic movement, but also in a conspiracy that went as far as assassinating President Madero and the vice president, so a new government, a conservative government, could come into office. This was a very, very sad movement. Henry Lane Wilson was put aside by Woodrow Wilson when he became president, although he was never sentenced or accused formally for wrongdoing. And of course, Woodrow Wilson entered into a new era of diplomacy in the world. He was a true believer in international law, and he carried out his mission throughout the First World War and then through the creation of the League of Nations, which he fought very hard. And he opened a new era of diplomacy, I would say, open diplomacy he fought for, and also diplomacy to establish a world order, and the establishment of a multinational institution, the League of Nations, with the beginning of the principle of collective self-defense, which is the principle of the rule of international law. If somebody is aggressive towards a country, the country has the right to defend itself and call upon others to do so according to international law. So this was a very low point in the relationship, and a point that furthered very strong nationalism. And with the enactment of the Constitution of 1917, there are a lot of restrictions for foreigners in the development of Mexican capital, a lot of restrictions for foreigners in the oil industry, in the mining industry, on the subsoil. It went back to the colonial times regime where everything under what's underground belongs to the state. And that is why Mexico has had such a restrictive oil policy since the Mexican Revolution. The first revolutionary governments didn't have a good start with the US. Nevertheless, very soon, another 30 years, and in 1947, we have another peak for the US-Mexico relationship. And this is after the Second World War, where we became military allies. Remember, Mexico joined the US to fight the Axis powers. And in 1947, President Truman visited Mexico City. It was the first time an American president, the US president, visited Mexico City, and he laid a wreath in the honor of the child soldiers who fought against American intervention exactly 100 years before. So that's how the cycle went around. After 100 years, the US Army was in Mexico City. 100 years later, the President of the United States went to Mexico City, recognized, honored those who had defended their country, and in private statement he said, well, if the United States had come to a reconciliation after the Civil War, why could not the two neighbors really forge an alliance and reconciliate what their differences were? And so it was. Mexico started a cycle of very intense development. It's called the Mexican Miracle, an era of import substitution that led to enormous growth during the 50s and 60s. Of course, as everything, it came to an end and started to deteriorate by the 70s. But nevertheless, during the Cold War, Mexico was a staunch ally to the United States, yet it had its own independent foreign policy, and yet it was the only country in the region that did not experience a military coup. It was the only country that didn't have a military government. Whatever criticism has been exerted for the ruling Partido Revolucionario Institucional, it certainly, for all its defects, they were less than those of the military juntas that ruled for many years in the countries of Central America and South America. So Mexico was able to sort out the Cold War, that very difficult period in history that when we look back at it, and as an era, if we think about 1947, 1989, it's an era in itself where it was very difficult for countries that were less developed to survive independently of the two major atomic powers. Mexico, in spite of being next door neighbor to the United States, managed to survive. with a relative independence. In spite of that, there were crises, and the major one, the thorough of this period, would be you probably all known about it and seen pictures and seen even a movie. In 1985, the DEA agent Enrique Camarena was murdered in the city of Guadalajara. And that brought about very difficult times in the bilateral relationship. I lived through it. At that time, I was already the Director General for North American Affairs at the Foreign Ministry. And believe me, it was very tough when we learned that there was a slowdown at the border by the US Customs Office, because they were desperate that the murderer or those who were guilty of assassinating Enrique Camarena were not found. So the retaliation was slow down things at the border. By this time, the economy, not only of the border, but the trade between both countries had grown so much that it became a major crisis. First, of course, more difficult for the weaker side, but after a week, it also showed that it was carrying its cost for the US side. And there was the murders of Quique Camarena were found, and the two governments had to start talks about how to really improve the relationship, because it was not serving either side these growing difficulties and administrative turf that manifested itself at the border. Less than 20 years later, NAFTA was signed, and that's the last and most important peak of the relationship. The recognition of the intertwining of the two economies, the recognition that there had to be rules set down in an agreement on how these two economies, and now including Canada, were going to, what were the rules of the game, and how they were going to work towards the future to become a more competitive region at the end of the Cold War versus the unification of Europe, which was becoming an economic giant, maybe a political dwarf, but still an economic giant, and the growth of the Pacific. So we signed NAFTA in 1994, which really is the beginning of a new era for the two countries. Very often has been said that it's like a marriage without the possibility of divorce. So crises have to be worked out no matter what, because there's none of the countries is willing to move to another continent. It's too expensive, it's too difficult. We have to live next to each other, and we better make the best out of it. So that is what NAFTA is all about. And that started a new era with clear rules of the game between the three big countries of North America. So where we are today? Well, under NAFTA, two new administrations coming in both countries, the second administration of President Obama, the new administration of Enrique Peña Nieto. It's always a moment to make a fresh start, and the two presidents have managed to do so. In the recent visit of President Obama to Mexico City, very significant. They have managed to diversify the agenda and talk not only about security, but talk about other issues confronting both countries for the future. How to become more productive, how to become more competitive, how to elevate the educational resources of both countries, how to look at the future together with a more intelligent border, while at the same time addressing the security issues. This is very promising. I think at this moment we are in a very promising stage for the renewal of the relationship with big optimism. That doesn't mean that we should leave the past behind and forget that there have been moments that have been more difficult, because we have to be able to deal with those We have to be able to deal with the reality, with the very, very complex realities of two countries that come from very different historical experiences and yet want to live together peacefully and with much more prosperity for all of its citizens. And this is the story I have to tell you. This is the story I tried to write without resentment. I promised myself I wasn't going to fall into the easy crying out, oh, how difficult it has been for Mexico to live with the United States. No, trying to look at it also from what opportunities it has meant. And that's why I call the peaks and troughs, the ups and the downs, and the difficulties, but yet the great opportunity that living next to each other is. Thank you very much.